Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you for coming. Feels like a lot has happened since October when we got together last. I don't have much to say about that, just because we don't know much. We can talk about it maybe during Q&A. So we're gonna do it a little bit differently this time because today we have an Atlas speaker. So Chris Perrine, who is the chief of party for the Atlas project, is going to introduce. And I'll just say, I'm John Furlow. I'm with USAID in the Climate Change Office, the adaptation team. This is our normally third Thursday monthly adaptation community meeting. We decided that because of the COP, we would not get together on the third Thursday of November. Because of the holidays, we would not get together on the third Thursday of December. Hope none of you came on whatever, or whatever. And don't come on December 22nd or whatever. So here we are in the middle, splitting the difference. We do this more or less third Thursday of each month. We do most of them here at Chemonics. Thank you to Chemonics for hosting us. We periodically will do one at the Woodrow Wilson Center. We have when we are trying to draw a much bigger crowd, no offense, Doug. So we did one on the next U.S. National Climate Assessment a couple months ago, and then we did one on what Paris would mean for the development and adaptation agenda. That was back in March. So if you are interested in presenting, this is an open, this is meant to be truly a community discussion. We like to have a presentation from somebody on some interesting work they've been doing, conversation amongst the audience, and then we try to save a little time at the end for just sort of milling about, getting to know each other. So please take advantage of that. And have a cookie or a Coke. You're in the room. You're on the web. I'm sorry.
Have your own cookie.
You're missing out. But thank you for joining us. So with that, I will turn it over to Chris. I'll make the house. The restrooms are best accessed by going through that door. If you go through that door, they get stuck outside of a badged area. So go that way if you need the restroom. I believe women's rooms are that way, and men's rooms are that way. The next talk will be in January. Back to third Thursday, right? Okay. Oh, I won't be here, but that's okay. So it'll be the second Thursday in January, and in February, she'll be back to normal schedule. And that will be another Atlas talk on some work in Mali, which Doug will elaborate on at the end of his talk. And if you would like to present, please write to Laura, or just respond to the Climatelinks invitation. So, Chris?
Okay, thanks, John. Today we're going to talk. So I'm Chris Perrine, and as said, I'm the chief of party for Atlas. We're glad to be out today. And John mentioned, Doug Baker is going to be talking to us today. The subject, as you see on the screen, is at climate risk, the cost of climate risk, trying to calculate it. And so Doug's going to go over some studies that have been done by others, and then he's going to talk specifically about a study that we did in Indonesia. Doug's a resource economist and an evaluation specialist. He's a 30-plus year veteran of the development experience. And for Atlas, he is our governance and evaluation advisor. So with that, Doug.
Thank you. We did not get together on the mafia the pinstripes there. Good. Good afternoon, everybody. Friends, Romans, hockey players. Somebody I ran into on the rink the other day. I am here, and what I'm going to do is to give you, I hope, a basic understanding of what it means when people talk about the costs of climate change, of how these costs might be calculated, some strengths and weaknesses, or at least some uncertainties in this, and of how this knowledge might be useful. Of course, as in most dense or complicated things, it can really only be an overview or a taste, because to get much deeper would take an all-day seminar, and to actually get to calculating and producing results would take many days, even if you had the data. And I'm going to do it in 10 minutes. So we're going to move right along. So anyway, why would this be useful? Why would we want to calculate something that we don't know will happen? And more, once having calculated it, something we're going to actively work to try to make not happen? Well, I guess the last question actually contains the answer in itself, because if you can't calculate it, even imperfectly, then you can't know what to do or even know whether it's important. So I usually start by describing and circumscribing the topic or the problem, what is in and what is not. And here I will only be talking about economic costs and not biophysical costs, the value of biodiversity, emotional costs from the loss of homeland or home culture when people are forced to migrate. I will be not talking about any of that. In addition, there's a concept in economics. As I mentioned, I'm a development economist, mostly in environmental economics. There's a concept in economics of economic accounting or economic profits versus financial accounting and financial profits, where the value is not simply money in and money out, but it's the value versus alternatives. I'm not going to talk about that either. This is economic costs in the sense of this is money versus some of those other values. Okay, and we're going to try to translate some of the other values, such as health, into economic costs. So why should we use a monetary metric? Why economics? Well, because it makes it possible to do comparisons across sectors, across provinces, or any other units of analysis. It allows us to compare market and non-market goods and services. It supports cost-benefit analysis. It makes it possible to relate costs that are likely to be imposed by climate change to the expenditures needed to adapt to those problems. And it supports decision-making about policy. So, in the first part, which is a general and overview, I will answer these questions, though not necessarily in that order, and then I will follow with an actual assessment that we did in Indonesia, as people mentioned. So, why would we want to do this study of economic costs of climate change, which I may abbreviate as ECCC, just because it's easier, less typing. And typically, studies of economic costs are at a high or a more macro scale, as this is the scale of information that we have at our hands. At a very macro and international scale, policymakers need to know the overall effects and relative effects on regions and countries so that they know which problems will be exacerbated where and which will lead to instability, migration, political movements. At a national or macro scale, we need to know about these costs to convince policymakers, we just talked about this, to make policy decisions about overall policies and strategies, including promoting activity in one sector versus another, or in one area of the country versus another. Some resources may be directed at coasts, for example, to fight the effects for a time, but eventually resources could be better used for adapting and helping populations move to other adapted areas. At a sectoral or even individual level, there is a need to know which products or processes will be affected so that one can adjust for producing them ones that are more suitable for the future climates. It is axiomatic that paying less now will avoid paying more later, whether in losses or in trying to adapt. It will cost us more to wait. Cost-benefit analysis would be much easier and more easily accepted, and if it weren't for the aspect of time, you have to start paying the cost now in hopes of getting future benefits in the form of something you hope never to see. But sooner or later, we will have to pay the costs. So the discounting of this is what I call the wimpy principle. Does anybody remember wimpy? I would gladly pay you tomorrow for a hamburger today. Remember that cartoon? 1930s practically. Gosh. Well, it was current when I was young. Anyway, one can either discount the loss in 2050, for example, to the present, but frankly, at almost any reasonable rate, it is not worth investing $1 billion now to save an equivalent $1 billion loss in 35 years. It is not. The rub is that the loss is not felt only 35 years from now. It's felt from now until then, and it will keep getting worse along the way. And in that case, it is worth investing now to avoid the loss later. So here, we will only cover studies having to do with costs, only on calculating the costs from climate change, not those that essentially do a cost-benefit analysis of options. I will not talk at all about figuring out exactly what we should do to adapt. Okay? Only going to work on the first half. In Uganda, for example, we were talking about this, that the study found that the losses from climate change would be more than 20 times the budget for adaptation if they could start with an adaptation budget now. So where have these studies been done? Well, they've been done in developed areas such as the US, EU, Australia, and many others. They've been done in developing countries, Mozambique, Nepal, Uganda, Mekong, Latin America, the Pacific, Southeast Asia, and I will refer to a few of these, but I will not get into any details in these. There have been many more since this map was done. This was 2013, but I wasn't going to give you a list because a map is always nicer than a list. And you're going to see plenty of lists. Econ Adapt, the people who did this, by the way, is funded by the EU, but it's non-official, and it's made up of research centers and universities. They produce some interesting stuff. So we're actually going to start to get into how this is done. What is involved in calculating these economic costs? Very simply, if we produce $1 billion of wheat this year, I'll use one of these, $1 billion of wheat this year in year X, and we know that with every degree of rise in the temperature, that yield is reduced by 5%, then when the climate warms 2 degrees, then ceteris paribus, and if you study economics, that means everything is held the same. I always wanted to get like 2 dogs, ceteris and paribus or something. Then we know that the yield will be 10% lower in year Y, and therefore my $1 billion of wheat will actually only get me $0.9 billion. Okay? This is really simple. And the value of the change in the economic activity, basically what today's talk is about, would be $0.1 billion, $100 million. Okay? Now, about half of you want to raise your hands and tell me that this is incredibly simplified. And the other half is just shaking your head about what a simpleton I am. But it's a little like saying that in American football, all you have to do is get from here to the other end. It's a lot more complicated than this, you can imagine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually look at these. Look at how you look at the value of economic activity, at how you look at projected climate change, at the effects, and of the final value and the value of the change. And this is the only slide that I have to spend any time on. The other ones can go fairly quickly. So in economic sectors, you probably can't read that. Typically, the more important sectors, naturally, are the ones that you want to include in your economic analysis. As why waste time on the minor ones, but also because these get closer to the actual effects on the overall GDP. And also, these are the ones with the best data. So usually we look at agriculture, manufacturing, fishing, in many places tourism, raw materials production, etc. We want value data for the sector or the area to be valued. For productive sectors, this may mean production, millions of tons of whatever, times the price, or sales data, total sales, price per ton, etc. It's best to get data as spatially differentiated as is necessary and as possible. For the U.S., prices of food, for example, will vary urban and rural, coastal versus non-coastal. You can't just use one price for a commodity for a whole country. But each detail implies and requires time and money and adds complexity. My wife often gives the example that they used to talk about is they could have the thing, they could have it fast, cheap, good. You can choose any two of those three. Fast, cheap, good. So anytime you want more detail, it's going to take you more and cost you more and be more complex. In Indonesia, for example, what you'll see is we got prices for a number of crops that we looked at for a number of provinces and extrapolated and applied those to the other provinces. We tried to get prices for each of the crops for each of the 33 provinces we were looking at, which is a complicated thing. So climate and climate change data. It is necessary, there it is, to know how the climate will change, obviously, but to know how the particular climate will change in the particular location under consideration. It can mean obtaining for each province or region in a country how much the temperature, rainfall, humidity, amounts and patterns and other aspects will change. The IPCC models that we've often talked about in these things that project climate change are according, as you know, to possible emissions and then to possible pathways from that point. The same CO2 emissions amount can have several different projections of effects, not only between scientific institutions, but also from each. As you know, there will be this model, and there will be this model, and there this, and even with the same model of emissions, there will be different projections of effects in different places. The range of models have been produced, and for these, a range of projections, such as rapidity and all. And I'm not going to get into any of that. Again, I'm not a climate scientist. We need to choose a model to apply to these, okay? And to those who want to throw out projections entirely because they don't agree with the idea of using these things which are very uncertain, I want to say that if one weather forecaster said it would rain at 6 tonight, and another said it would rain at 7, and a third at 8, that I would not decide that it was not going to rain, and not only not take my umbrella, but not allow others to have umbrellas. Just because there's uncertainty doesn't mean it's all totally wrong or not useful. Clearly, the more detailed or the more localized data one can get, the more accurate will be the analysis when it's put out spatially. A global 2 degrees is of little use. The regional that's still not enough detail. National may likely not be enough use for you to do an economic one, except perhaps for the Gambia or something. So you've got to downscale if possible. In Uganda, they downscaled to 20 by 20 kilometer grids, which is appropriate for a country that has glaciers, even though it's on the equator. So it has fewer and smaller glaciers all the time, actually. So again, if one knew only that an entire island was going to be warmer, then one could get some idea of the effects. But if you knew that one side of the island was going to get much warmer than the other, perhaps because of the winds or rain patterns, then you could be more accurate for each product that's produced on that island. So finally, this is complicated. The effects of climate change on each sector or product. So to join the data on the existing state to data on climate change so you can produce information, it's necessary to know how the productive activities react to the climate conditions, principally rainfall and temperature changes, and where in this spectrum the sector is. Generally, more water in dry conditions will lead to an increase in production. This is obvious. Generally, warmer temperatures in colder climates will lead to more production. However, warmer temperatures may be too much when the climate is already at the maximum of the viability of the growing of those crops. So there are general studies of what happens to the most important crops according to changes in temperature, changes in rainfall and such. For Indonesia, we used a local study that was done in Indonesia there, but that's not a guarantee that this study was either better than the general studies or more applicable. We just decided that we would try to use the local study. So, nearly done with this, and as I say, this is the only complicated slide that's there. So we got a new value. ceteris paribus. It means we did not change the amount of land that we planted in these things, right? Nor did we change the amount of labor that was applied to these. There's a couple of seats up in front. It may be hard to get there. You're welcome to come on through. So, again, ceteris paribus, and what happens? So what might be real-world problems with calculating this? One is impossible numbers that result when coefficients, which are valid at the margin or over shorter ranges, end up being logically impossible when extended. So that it might be valid for half a degree, but if you say I've got 2 degrees of change here, is that still valid? Well, a 200% reduction in production or yield is logically impossible, right? Even if when you calculate it, the number comes out at 200%. So logically, the numbers will not always come out in the real world. In Uganda, to measure the value of water, again, this is a non-market thing, the study used the willingness to pay. We all know willingness to pay surveys. Willingness to pay for water, assuming population and consumption growth. But if it's physically impossible to actually produce that much water, no matter how much demand there is, or if it's unrealistic to devote more than 100% of the projected income, then the calculation is really not useful, right? You've reached the boundary and something else has got to go. So that was the most complicated and most informational slide that I have up here. Now we can get to some stuff that's a little bit easier. Okay, what would be an example? And I'm going to stick here in agriculture. Remember that the value of the economic activity here and the change is equal to the yield, what you produce, times the price. Okay? In this case here, this is a graph of the impacts of climate change on crop yields. Remember I talked about impact of climate change on crop yields. And this is differentiated, and I'll go over this, according to both the crop and to the place, the location, as much as possible. These here are rice, wheat, other grains, fruits, vegetables, sugarcane, oil seeds, etc. This is 0. Now, I could have put it so that 0 was one way, but your heads all would have been this way. And anyway, you can look that almost everyone is projected to have a decrease everywhere, with rare exceptions. Rare exceptions like Chile, Japan, Canada, and Russia, which is not here. A drop in this case here, a drop only in yield. Yeah, but remember that in economics we're going to call that. But this here is one of the background information. This is yield. But this is very important. In fact, that's what I said. Remember, we're not talking about agriculture production. So this is just by sectors, but you can see if this is what's happening to the yields, then in the absence of other things going on, like planting more land and such, then people are going to see less production, less value, okay, less food. We project that for nearly every country, except for a few countries which are now temperate to cold, then everyone else will likely see decreases in yields absent new technologies and all of that sort of thing. Now, why might some of the ones such as Canada or Russia see an increase, at least in production? Why? Because they can bring more land on. More land comes and becomes viable because it's warmer. Okay, not necessarily because there's more yield there for these crops, but more land becomes viable, and indeed those lands might become more productive as well. So you can pay attention to these yields for now for corn, wheat, and all of that sort of thing, because you might want to invest or disinvest in some of these later if you own stocks in those. So I know this is complicated. In the central projection, in 2050 relative to the current climate, 2050. So we're talking decreases of 10 to 20% for most of those, for most of the regions. I should have been more clear about that. For most of the crops in most of the regions by 2050, the projections, this is by the OECD, are for something like 10 to 20% less yield. No, the benchmark is now, and in 2050, therefore 35 years. Yeah. So what kinds of economic cost studies have been done? First point, market versus non-market. For the non-market, we need to impute some kind of a value. In Indonesia, we were just talking about this, we valued health costs by the loss of work days and the cost of treatment. Okay? It's not that we don't put any value on people's suffering or any of that sort of thing. It's just that you can't put an economic value on these non-market things. We have to find a way to put an economic value on it. So there's things that you can do in the market and things that you can do that are non-marketed to bring them into the study. And the second is the typical sectors. I mentioned before that you typically want to do this in the important sectors because you want to get as much of your economy into your study as possible. And the most common sectors, the EPA, Department of Energy here, did one that included water, health, agriculture, sea level rise, energy, marine ecosystems, etc. For here, in the UK, there's these marketed goods or services, coastal zones, water resources, agriculture, infrastructure, and non-marketed. They tried to put values on there. Human health, biodiversity, recreation, culture, leisure, working time, etc. They needed to find a non-market, a way to impute value to non-market things. For Mozambique, they looked at agriculture, energy, coastal areas, infrastructure. You can hear that there's a consistency in these. This here is categories that were considered by the OECD in theirs. You can see in some of these they were able to include them because they were market, and in some of these they had to take and do a standalone study on it and say, we can't quite reconcile and bring this into the big model, but we think it's important. We can do a separate study on that. Very, very interesting. That OECD work is actually very interesting. So, and of course, in our study that we'll get to in about 5 minutes, we covered agriculture, health, and sea level rise in Indonesia. And even within those, it was limited. So now, what have been some results? And I'm going to talk about every one of these in detail here, and we're going to be here for about a week or so. No, I'm not. But there's a variety of nice graphs. No, we're going to get rid of that. We're actually going to talk about something a little more interesting than that. So recall the earlier study on ag production by crops. And so you can look here at the results for Russia and Canada. We already looked at those. They project that there is a chance under these conditions that Canada and Russia will see less damage, and we'll see a positive percentage change in GDP in those sectors. And that's provided that they take advantage of them, obviously. You still have to do the work, and you still have to organize yourself for those. Everyone else sees a likely reduction in the GDP as losses to climate change. The Uganda study I mentioned found 2 to 4% loss of GDP by 2050. The EPA study found hundreds of billions of economic losses for the U.S. with major effects in infrastructure. The Risky Business study, which was a private study done here in the U.S. by some very important academics, found that there was a risk in the Midwest and in the plains of up to 50% or 70% in average annual crop yields, corn, soy, cotton, and wheat, with the expected climatic changes. And up to $100 billion worth of existing coastal property will likely be below sea level, and up to $700 billion below sea level in 2100. And labor productivity, particularly of outdoor workers, could be reduced by as much as 3% by the end of the century. And that's, we're finally also getting to another category here, labor and such. For the EC, right, the Europeans, the Joint Research Center, which is official, something like an overall loss of 1.8% in GDP by 2070, mostly from the health effects, including effects on workers, but it masks a larger 3% loss in Southern Europe and a smaller loss in Northern Europe, where in fact they would have gains, at least in their energy costs, right? As it gets warmer, got to heat less. So I'm going to wrap this up and get on to looking at details. This here is a summary of some of the characteristics of economic cost studies that I have been talking about. They're limited in sectors, typically agriculture, health, labor, certain services such as water supply. Market goods and services are more easily calculated than non-market. That's what I said before. They acknowledge a high level of uncertainty, both uncertainty because of what will happen climatically, we depend on models, and of how activities will react. And for the most part, we have to use what they call general equilibrium studies, where we worry about how everything will react to everything, or it would be like the universe in which there's multiple universes happening every second on ad infinitum into the future. This cannot be done in a study. So there's more confidence in results from now to 2050, naturally, which is only 35 years, than for beyond. Results. Every region will see losses with these lowest or even some gains in certain sectors in temperate areas, and losses that are especially large in Africa and Asia, which also have the largest population growth, obviously, and are already the poorest. Generally, agriculture will have the largest losses because of the lower yields. Losses to sea level rise will continue to increase over this time. And losses of 1% to more than 12% are envisioned in specific unusual cases like the Pacific Islands, with most of the studies being in the 2 to 4% range by 2050 or 2060. Okay, this is still quite significant. These sorts of things could wipe out most of the gains that in people's incomes and standard of living. Yeah, they could just wipe them out. What uncertainties? These kinds of studies do not take into account specific adaptation investments or changes in practices, or in fact, as we mentioned, any kind of dynamic changes in there. They don't take into account high impact extreme events, which are projected to increase, like hurricanes, typhoons, and such. You cannot do that because we just accept in the most general way to say that there may be one every 5 years or something. So in general, they don't include those. And they don't take into account other human costs, such as migration. So too many graphs and too many of these things. So there's the real world. There's real people. And I was thinking, somebody that I used to work with said, you know, in every presentation you're supposed to show puppies or kittens or whatever. I didn't do that. But for a break from the numbers, I did want to show something from the real world. And the African woman is being rescued with her bicycle. Meanwhile, the power boats in the U.S. have nowhere to go. But this also shows you the disparate effects of climate change on people according to their socioeconomic status. So I'm done with all of that general stuff and the general overview. I hope it was at least somewhat interesting. Thank you. Good. Now, oh, you don't have to. It's all right. They're just happy I'm almost done. Okay. So what does one study look like in detail? And I'm going to show you what we did, and I'm just going to go through some of the results here and talk a little bit about how we did it, and also talk a little bit about how we solved the problems that we identified earlier in the basic questions, problems having to do with price and products and projections and provincial data and all of these things, how we solved those in this study, to the extent we solved them. We used provincial level information about all of those because we wanted to get really as differentiated prices and effects as we could, and identify what was going to happen in each of the 33 at the time provinces in Indonesia. We also wanted to provide what we call actionable information to the government of Indonesia and to the USAID APIK, which is a new project which is out there in Indonesia, helping to do climate change adaptation. And so we did brief them while we were there and gave them the results and their work in certain specific parts of Indonesia. So we think we were useful to them in that aspect. So I just want to say that this study was done for Atlas by Dr. Joy Hecht, who has done a number of these studies for many years for USAID, for a number of the consulting firms, and I've worked with her before, with Indonesian consultants who got info, who did some of the analysis, who provided realistic perspectives and reviews, and we also contracted an Indonesian GIS expert as well through WRI, which is WRI has an office out there. And I worked with WRI many years ago, and so I keep friends with it, and so I connected with them for that. I was the study manager, which means I did help form the team and find the people, and I helped to decide some of the aspects such as data and analysis, and I worked on reporting and presenting, and I got to sign stuff too, which is what managers do. So, assessment overview. We're going to look at a couple of the overall aspects and then get right to sea level rise, health, and agriculture. And this is just like what we talked about before. It's to 2050 based on prices from now, from when we could get it in the last couple of years, based on prices and on population. We could only use one climate scenario, which is A1B, which is the middle of the range. We did not, though of course nowadays middle of the range may be something completely different. And we covered only agriculture, health, and coastal impacts, and only aspects of those. We did, however, cover the whole country for each of the provinces, and what I do want to point out here is Jakarta, here on the island of Java. The point I mentioned before here, climate is already not the same across any particular big country, though it may be across some small ones. Or even, as you can see here, across any large island. These are thought to have different climates for different regions according to their rainy seasons and such on each of these islands. Okay? Whether because of prevailing wind patterns or because of their topographic features or whatever, they have different climates, different weather, different climates on these. So we start out with a differentiated climate. And then the projections say they will have different changes in different places. And you can see for each of the 33 provinces, there's differences in what's expected in the temperature and differences in rainfall, including in a few less, because they fall into a rain shadow that's projected. Again, this comes out of the IPCC models, downscaled as much as we can for there. And again, it's 33 provinces rather than 34 because that's the data we had at the time. Nowadays, it's 34 provinces. You can see, these go fast, whoops, population projections. We had to start with data that we had for now with what would be their projections. We knew we had the projections from the Indonesians to 2035. We had to further extrapolate from that because we wanted all of our numbers to line up in 2050. Why is this important? It's not really important in ag, and it's not important in sea level rise. It is important in health. If we're projecting what will be the health costs in 2050, we have to know how many people will be there. Pardon? Why it's important? Because we're talking about we'll get there, but the number of work days lost. So we have to have an idea of how many people there will be to lose the work days. Who will be affected by malaria, who will be affected by dengue. Yeah. So I'm into it. Sea rise. What did we do? We took an average of about 33 centimeters, which is a projected number, which is about a foot, by 2050. We used digital elevation data in a GIS. We overlaid land use, land cover, to determine what kinds of activities would be flooded, what would be on those low-lying areas on the coast. And we've had to figure out how would we get to a value for those things? How would we get to an economic impact on those? And we had to get to an idea of what was there and then what its value was. That is for hotels, for offices, you'd have to get an idea of what would be rents for offices. You'd have to get an idea of what would be values of houses that would be flooded. You'd have to get an idea of offices. You'd have to get some idea of all of these things. It's quite complicated, as you can imagine, since we are not into the municipal values in these places. Again, we did not try to extrapolate out economic multiplier effects. What happens when the port closes and no one can export and all of these things. We were just looking at kind of the values of stuff that gets flooded. Okay, to give you an idea of how complicated this is, this is a GIS. These are contour lines for the whole country. You can see that they're quite crowded here in the left. We zoom in. This here is between Java and Jakarta's right about here. You can see in this promontory there's a lot of lines. That means topographically there's a lot of difference here. Zoom in. This is what it looks like. Zoom in further. As an idea, I went ahead and I circled two areas here on that same promontory, on that same end of that. This one here, you can see the contour lines come quite close to the edge here. And this one here, you can see that they're quite far. What does that mean? It means for the same amount of sea level rise, the one on the left will suffer less flooding than the one on the right. Okay. Well, you can imagine how complicated this is for a country with 17,000 islands and an almost unimaginable coast and tens of thousands of villages and all of that. So there was a lot of GIS power that was applied to this thing. Some of the runs had to be left running overnight or even a couple of days on a computer, and I think we cooked a couple of laptops along the way because they just couldn't keep up with this stuff. But we were able to say, by combining all of these things and the values, we were able to get an idea of the value of what would be lost in there. I've heard that someplace before. Okay, and I will do it fairly quickly, but basically the losses of offices and such that get flooded are about half of the value. But really the most important thing in here, and I will show you, is that almost all the cost is incurred in Jakarta. Why? Costs more, exactly. Yeah. It's because Jakarta is urban and because the values are so much better. That we're saying that a flooded hectare in some little island out there is not as valuable as a flooded hectare in Jakarta. Okay? It's just that it's not as nice, or it's not that it's not as nice or it's not as important, but we're putting an economic cost on here. So if you see the value of what gets flooded in this stuff, it's largely in Jakarta and in other urban areas, obviously, because those places are more valuable than not. We showed this to APIC and discussed it, and they work in certain urban areas, and they're intending to work with the insurance industry. They could find this sort of thing extremely useful in deciding what is threatened and what's the value. They would have access to more detailed valuation, city records, cadastres, those sorts of things, and more detailed maps and GIS. So at a city or provincial scale and not a national scale, it would be much more doable than this. So on the other hand, it's unimaginable private companies are not doing that already. Certainly, if you have stock in anyone that's not doing this, then you should sell that too. So, in some ways, the sea level rise one was a different study from the other one, and because of the compromises we had to make, it's a little less satisfying, but still interesting in itself. I want to go quickly to health. We only looked at malaria and dengue fever. which are sort of environmental diseases in the sense that they will be largely influenced by the environment. Okay, not cancer and those sorts of things, which have their own reasons. We had to measure it in disability-adjusted life years, DALYs, D-A-L-Y, which is an international metric that, in other words, days that you lost, or if you died, years that you did not work, that sort of thing. And there were research studies, fortunately, for this that were applicable in Indonesia. Okay, so dengue fever accounts for most of the cost in here. 40 million rupiahs. 40 million rupiahs is about $4.3 billion at the exchange rate of the time, which was about 9,300. Think of 10,000 to rupiah to the dollar. Think of 10,000. Pardon? It's more, well, it's also because who gets dengue? People in urban areas get dengue. Who people in urban areas, they're worth more than people in rural areas. Sorry. Their economic output is worth more. Yes, a loss of a year to a person in Jakarta who's working is worth more than a person in Papua. Yeah, I know that. 40 million is worth about $4 billion or so. Okay, it's about 10,000 to 1 at the time. It's more now. Okay, 5.7 million would be about 600 million US dollars. Okay, we can talk about these. But there, because it's an urban problem there, and there will be more rain, so there will be more water, and everybody knows what Jakarta is like. So it's expected that dengue will be a worse problem, and it will cost a lot because it's Jakarta. Okay. Meanwhile, you see malaria only in places like Papua, jungle, etc. Okay, so it's not at all unexpected here. I want to get to the last one, agriculture. I'm going to focus only on these crops: soybean, maize, and rain-fed and irrigated rice, sugarcane. Why? They're very important food crops, and they're the only ones for which we had a model of how they would react to changes that was actually done from research there in Indonesia. Okay, and obviously we did not change the area or other changes in technology or any of this sort of thing. Overall, the impact on agriculture is negative, as you might expect, but where certain changes in rainfall could affect yield in certain places, there could be a calculated positive impact in certain places that were drier and now receive more, thank you, and now receive more rain. But the overall impact is negative, and where rainfall has no impact, then the value of the output should drop due to the increased temperatures. Okay? The impact of some of these is not known. When we did the calculations, some of them came out to be more than 100% increase, etc. We decided fairly arbitrarily to limit the increase to 100% because we just didn't know how else to handle that. We couldn't project 1,000% increase according to this. And as we explained before, it just didn't make sense to keep multiplying what would be a marginal by a large amount. So you have to make some decisions, even if they sound somewhat arbitrary. Of course, more rain in some places might be good, but it might also be so much that it completely washes the crop out. So we had to do that. So what is the impact? Whoops. Got the right button. The impact here is largely negative because of the impact on irrigated rice. Mostly because of the increased temperatures, okay? But in a few places, there could be a positive impact on rain-fed rice in places which were short of water before, okay? Not going to get too deep into this. What would be the impact by province? There are some major negatives because of the changes in climate change, and in a couple of cases, positives because of possible changes in rainfall patterns. Okay? This is the overall impact. Now, all of these are the island of Java. Jawa Barat, Jawa Tengah, here, Jawa Timur, all of these are the island of Java. That's going to have a major impact on local food availability for the urban Jakarta and Yogyakarta, for example. Okay? It means they have to import more from other islands. But if this holds, this would be a significant result. Almost done. Total impact by sector. This again just adds up what we just saw a minute ago. There you can see that agriculture is the largest loss, health is a significant loss, and sea level rise is another loss. They all add up to the one on the left. Now, by province, and this is just about the last slide, by province, total economic impact of climate change by province is still quite negative in Jakarta and in the Java provinces. In the others, less, smaller amount, and in a couple, again, possibly for those reasons, positive. For Jakarta, as you can see, it's basically all health and all sea level rise loss there. Now, this is by province. By per capita, okay, these squeeze because there are millions of people in Jakarta. So on a per capita basis, their economic loss will be much smaller. And on a versus income basis, it will be even smaller because, of course, a loss of 1 million rupiah to somebody in Jakarta is much less than the loss of 1 million rupiah to somebody in Papua. Conclusions? This is the conclusions for the Indonesia study. You could see it was neither comprehensive nor exact. We can't do exact in here anyway. It covers major portions of the economy, that is agriculture and health, and it's a good, as I point of departure. You always want to say there should be some more study done on this. I hope somebody pays for it. But that's always one of the conclusions, is that you could actually get more into details on this thing. One of the things that we found was that it really is essential to do more research on impacts on specific crops in specific places. We can't simply take the international one that something's going to go down 20% here and apply it. We simply can't do that. And we also didn't, again, analyze extreme storms because we couldn't predict them, nor macroeconomic consequences. So the last recommendation, one more recommendation, is that even though we're projecting this, 132 trillion rupiahs, 1.8%, 1.5% of the economy, in 2050, it won't happen only in 2050. It will happen gradually and increasingly along the way. So you can't simply wait until here and say, oh, I'm going to fix this in 2050. Okay? That's why it's important to start now. Because this whole thing is lost, assuming linear functions and all of that, because this whole thing could be lost along the way. So, that's it. I hope that I've managed to answer some of the questions we posed at the beginning, and that the example from Indonesia has given you a better idea of the real results and of the challenges involved in producing them. And again, studies at this high level of abstraction cannot really help decision makers. They can't help them make specific micro or even sectoral choices for action. They can only help to alert potential magnitude and the urgency and give some idea of priority sectors. Okay? They can still be useful, but they are not the complete package, either for their own piece nor for the part where we're comparing to adaptation choices. So, thank you. So, I'd be happy to take, pardon? why don't you manage it? I'll just say I'd be happy to take questions about things that I can answer here. Yeah.
So let me start by saying thank you, Doug. Very interesting, and I'm glad with your final point. I was wondering whether I should ask, so what's anybody going to do with this? Because it's not specific enough, and people generally don't make decisions for 30, 50, 60, 70 years out. I think your last slide with the increasing intensity of trouble is a useful one. So maybe as we take other questions, if you could get at some point work in, rather than doing something like this in more detail, is there something else that would be more useful for decision makers to give them information that they have power to act on? So if you would identify yourselves, and this microphone looks like a microphone, or it is a microphone, but it doesn't amplify in the room, but it is apparently working for people on the web, and people on the web, if you would type in questions, we will work you in. And I'm going to start back here by the column, and again, please identify yourself and then ask your question. I know you see your question.
I'm totally interested. My name is Jerry Hush. I'm a sociologist, and for the last 5 years was working on an innovative product. This is actually more a comment than a question, on what we were calling climate action intelligence. And I'm very excited because what you have done is precisely what we call the base topographic layer of a multi-layered tool that enables us to go from the abstract issue all the way down to what we're seeking to do in terms of the granularity and how can we make these decisions. So I guess the comment is, how can we make sure that our work is actually going to be coordinated, or how can we collaborate? Because this is clearly something where I think there's a chance for the two innovation to work on.
Atlas, or we USAID, or we Chemonics, or there's a lot of we's there. Remember, what Atlas does is we're essentially the think tank for USAID on climate change adaptation. We do studies and assessments, and we create tools, and this at the request of either Central or the missions, and then they request things that they think would be useful to them and to others. So we would do anything that we were asked to do. Of course, we're contractors. We would do whatever we were asked to do, but it is possible that USAID might find this sort of thing useful and might want to send it to others. Now, as far as Atlas, we would be happy. I would be happy, and I think Joy would also be happy. Joy would also be happy to talk to you about where else it might go and what other thoughts you have on this. She tends to do a study, and then it gets turned over. We might be interested in doing a study and then kind of seeing where else we can take it. So my name should be up there and all of that.
Health systems management. I thought John was very diplomatic in his comment about the recommendations, but I would say that more studies is a nice recommendation for most research, but don't we know enough to start to use the information?
I would think at least in your area, which I know we talked before, is health and your health systems management. I would think pinpointing this possible effects on dengue fever and malaria would be enough to actually make some decisions about devoting attention to those areas in the places identified. To saying, yeah, we need a dengue fever campaign in urban areas. See a pot, turn it over. See a whatever, drain it out. I would think that kind of information in that area, less so in sea level rise or in ag or something, in that area might be enough to say, yeah, this is something that we actually should do. So I kind of agree on that.
Okay, I'm Noha Abdelkarim. I work for North American Electric Reliability Corporation. We do manage the U.S. and Canada bulk power system, and we do assessment for climate change and any environmental regulation that is in effect or proposed. I have a problem with the with the long-term projections that, you know, all the input parameters with these yearly projections and whatever these input parameters will go into which model. For example, year one, which is the economic model. So I haven't seen, maybe it's in your study, detailed study, but I haven't seen this sort of sensitivity analysis that, you know, gives me, instead of a scale or hard number for each year until 2050, sort of like a range of the impact of, you know, the economic cost based on such environmental or climate change. I'm not an environmental guy at all, but it's I'm an engineer. And the second thing is that because we deal with a lot of policymakers and, you know, decision makers in the White House, it is very difficult to make them, you know, go ahead and, you know, kick off something, you know, regulations or start changing something unless there is a problem already happening. So how could these studies, you know, in all of the, you know, collaborative effort with a lot of organizations that could make a change up for the policymakers, not just people are excited about the climate change issues. How could that translate into policymaker mind that there is really an issue? Thanks.
I can probably answer the first question a little bit better. I represented it there as the change and the losses as a very linear function, because we simply don't know. We don't know if in fact it curves this way or it curves this way with more losses in the beginning or more later, or in fact that's not it at all. All we can say is that by that point this is what we see, and based on the prices and values now, this is what we see. And we know that it can't just happen in year 35, in year 2050, so there must be some kind of projection. But I can't give you in any way an actual progression in there. Nor do I think that I'm not a climate change scientist, though I play one on TV. No, I'm not a climate change scientist to know how their projections say that it will grow increasingly or if it's fairly linear or what. So I can't tell you that 10 years from now we'll see 10% of this problem or 20% of this problem or etc. I really can't. And these models, given the uncertainty in all of this, can't. Chris, you may be able to.
The other case, I mean, the reason that at this point in history, 2016, that we go out to 2050 roughly, is that's when we sort of get beyond the realm of what we call variability in the climate field into climate change. In the variability gap between now and then, as Doug says, things vary, and it's very difficult to tell, you know, on an annual basis or even on a you know, a decadal basis, what's going to happen within that 5-year period or 10-year period. You know, I mean, for instance, we might have an extremely harsh winter in the Mid-Atlantic this year. That has nothing to do with what's going on in terms of climate change in the longer term, as we all know.
On your second point about what could a study like this or a different study do to motivate, I guess, your constituency or your clientele, I think you should tell us that. And I have a quarrel with this type of long-term broad study because it's not connected to a specific decision. This can inform, just like the IPCC studies. The IPCC studies early on were meant to answer the question, do we have a problem and should we act on it? Not, what should I plant in 2050? So if there's still a need to motivate decision makers in Indonesia that they might have a problem, this could be useful. If they're already spinning away and trying to figure out what to do, then we should hear from them, well, what's your where are you willing to act first? Where do you have authority to take action? And what information could inform, how do you make decisions, and what information could we feed to you that would help you make a better decision? And so I think electric utilities in the United States and Canada, I would imagine that their most immediate needs are to know what's the demand load going to be in the next season for either heating or cooling. And then as they begin making longer term investments, longer term heating and cooling degree days would be useful to have, but probably more, I would imagine they'd be more interested in certainty or lack of certainty around the regulatory environment. So I think we'd have to hear from you, and I think that's why co-developed studies are very valuable, because then you can tell people like Doug or whoever's doing the studies, we're not going to use all of that. This is what we need. Can you help us get that? Are these comments on this question, or okay? Sorry, we will get back to you. Was yours a comment on the question? Yeah. Okay.
Kujay Singha with Saranda Bank Consulting Company. Just towards your question, one of the things that some of our clients have been working with around doing studies is actually focusing on agricultural products as an example and looking towards futures pricing. So like in coffee, for example, coffee production and its impact, and what sort of adaptation, should they be looking at modeling into pricing for future production of coffee. And so that has started to drive change from the private sector perspective, because it's going to impact their market pricing. So
futures as in next year is weather. Futures as in whether to plant a tree, a coffee tree, which is going to produce 10 years from now. That's heading towards climate, but next year is weather. Yeah. 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 I saw these people saying yes, as I would say that.
We also discuss internally as technical people the projections for, how the demand growth or how the changes in regulation will impact utilities and the demand and supply balance. We have been told several times that you cannot make longer term projections over a 5 years period because it's meaningless. So I think that the struggle here, because the climate change, the momentum on that is not moving. We have been, I've been hearing about it for several years, and just, talk, is that maybe it is that policymakers and countries, they are seeing it as a doomsday scenario. Hey, people are climate, experts, they just want to make a scary scenario for the future of the the earth, and that is not true, right? We are seeing changes, and because of these long-term projections is not like split it into buckets of 5 or 10 years. It's just 20, 30 years. They're blind, they're blocked, they can't see that.
I would think that you guys, when you're making decisions about power plants, you've got to worry about 20 years from now, because it takes 10 years, it takes 5 years to get approved, 10 years to build it, and its life is 50 years. So I'm sure that you're interested in the long term. Please.
I was wondering, limitations or dangers of valuing land or lives more or less based on, urban rural?
Good question. Yeah, it's an economic study. It's only a study about productivity that is in the market as much as possible. It's possible that people in rural areas may be producing things that are non-market or non-marketed, but we have to have some kind of metric, because we also have to have a metric for deciding where to invest to adapt. But in terms of valuing urban people more than rural people, yeah, it's a danger. It's not something that you like to do. Yeah.
Greg Michaels from ICF. I guess one of the benefits and the curses of economics is that we talk about market responses. I guess your one hand was tied behind your back by taking current prices. Understood. If we actually tried to do this, on a global scale, not only looking at international prices, yields, demand responses, and at the country level, and even to a certain degree at the province level. So if you have the opportunity to, you might take the opportunity to see what could be done with that information.
And they did it according to projected climate.
Yes, under various scenarios, A1B, and other things. So, yeah, I was concerned by the truncation, for example, of the yield increase at 100%. I think you sort of let the cards fall where they may. But more important than that are the demand responses, because you may find that Indonesia becomes a major importer of rice if it can no longer produce it, but it becomes a corn producer. So you'd want to think about that. I wish that kind of analysis existed for infrastructure, because that's obviously highly valuable and very active, market. So
that's cool. I'd love to extend some of these, but you can't extend all of them. You've got to choose, fairly narrow. Cool.
Hi, my name is Mark Brashatsky, and I'm a climate financial risk manager. And so when you're assessing the amount of risk that's attached to each particular region that you're looking at, and you're quantifying the economic damage that's being done and attaching a dollar figure to it, for each particular region, how do you go about estimating an appropriate discount rate to calculate the present value of what's being done 20, 30 years from now today?
That's a very good question. In other words, time preference and such, the discount rate that for a person in the UK may apply to something could be quite different from the discount rate that someone in Africa applies. That to them something next year, we think of, I'll pay I'll gladly pay you tomorrow for my hamburger today. But is it worth 10% next year, or is it worth 5% less next year, or whatever? And so, actually, different people, according to their prevailing socioeconomic conditions, would probably apply different discount rates. I was just reading in the UK study that they were using, I don't want to say 2%, 3%, or whatever per year out, because it also depends on how many years out you project it. I hadn't really thought of differentiating time preference discount rates according to the region. Yeah. Cool. There are studies that do bring it back to what is the present value. I'm trying to think of one out of this that I've looked at here, and what is the actual net present value of that. You know yourself, as you said, after 20 years or so, almost any discount rate gives you no value for something that's out there. Yeah. Cool.
So this is just a quick clarification. I'm not sure that it came through completely clear what the objective of the study was, because some of the comments and questions have hit this directly or indirectly. We all agree, I think, that there's a lack of granularity with respect to the results here, and so it isn't useful for making specific decisions in specific sectors or geography necessarily. But that wasn't the objective. The objective at the time that this study was commissioned, there had just been a change in administration in Indonesia, and there was some question as to whether climate change writ large and climate change adaptation specifically was going to remain high on the agenda of the new incoming president. So this was meant to be sort of a shot in the arm to remind them that climate change is real, the costs thereof are real and enormous, and you ought to keep it on your agenda. Maybe we need something similar here.
You're stealing my thunder.
What happened? You mean in Indonesia or to this study? Oh, I can't tell you really what's happening in Indonesia. To this study, we've presented it to various ministers in various parts of the government, and really turned it over to the local people, the local project and such, to be working actually on getting the results to them. Yeah. And this is, but this is the tool that the mission would use, not us. We produce tools for them. This is a tool that the mission would use in their discussions and negotiations with the government of Indonesia, because as you know, with the CDCS process and all of these, they look out what's 5 years, and they would say, Indonesia, we think that this is going to be a big problem for you. Here's the reason why we think it. We have this study that shows this. Can we help you in this area in the next 5 years? That's more like it. Go ahead, somebody else.
Is it fair to ask how long it took your team to assemble this study? Yeah, so I mean, this could be like a career project, and so you know you got to start somewhere. And although the focus, the presentation is quantitative in nature, it seems like you're saying to a large degree you want your results to be interpreted qualitatively. Here's where we can have priorities. Here's where risk is the greatest, and where the quantitative may come in handy is when advocates are facing policymakers and saying you're going to spend money now or you're going to spend money later, and you know this is the scale of spending you're looking at.
There are spreadsheets mentioned in the thing there. They're available on Climatelinks, and if you order before midnight tonight, we'll send you a policy brief as well. But anyway, in the spreadsheets, it's 50-something spreadsheets, about 30,000 cells and calculations in there, every product and years and province and according to climate change and all of these sorts of things. And you can go in and change some of the parameters. It's all unlocked. Change some of the parameters and such, and see what happens to the results. Go ahead.
Expressing outcomes in terms of dollars is useful because it's the best way we have of building a bridge between the scientific community on the one hand and the decision-making, policy-making community on the other, because they don't speak the same language fundamentally. So I was curious about a couple of the details of your methods, and I don't want to get into the weeds too much. I was curious about the models you used for plant productivity, you know, due to age, based on climate change, and I couldn't find the references in the spreadsheets, but I can ask you about that later. I did want to ask on the interpretations of the health effects, on the estimates of health effects. Do you know, in your researches, did you draw any methodology from the methods used by the EPA in the United States? And then a second question is, again, in your researches, did you come across any evidence of a study comparable to this being conducted in the United States? And I could think of it being developed by an agency like the EPA in the academic community or by the insurance companies, basically.
I have the reference, and I did mention in here, EPA, I didn't put it up, but I did mention it. I don't think it's EPA and MIT worked on similar one. There's 2 or 3 for the U.S. that I have references for. And that other one, Risky Business, is kind of an interesting one. As I say, it's put together by businessmen, including Blumenthal and Bloomberg and such. And so it's a private sector perspective on it as opposed to EPA risky business. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I was going to say something about your first point. I don't remember what it is anymore.
We've got about 5 more minutes here to go here, and we'll try to get Eric back there. And then
Hi, my name is Marisol Maddox. I actually had a question about the role of natural capital accounting. I know like the World Bank has been leading some work with the WAVES initiative. Okay, so I'm just really curious about if that was something you had discussed including in this study, or if that's something that like will, if there's much discussion about including that in more future studies, like looking at actual like the value of ecosystem services.
There are a number of studies that try to include the value of ecosystem services in these sorts of ones. And of course, there are ones that are specifically about valuing ecosystem services, which is different from natural capital in the sense of a stock and a flow. You know, it's what's provided. I should mention that Joy Hecht, H-E-C-H-T, her business used to be about valuing natural capital there. She did a lot of the pioneering work on that. This was 10, 15 years ago when she helped a number of countries come up with that. But in recent years, she's done more of this valuation of environmental changes and such. According to climate change, but also I just got a note from her today, and she's working on a couple of these studies having to do with the use of development and its effects on stocks of natural capital. What's the value of what you're losing when you develop these? So look her up, and I can put you in touch with her. Yeah, and actually her email is probably in the spreadsheet, I believe.
I'm John Furlow's colleague in the Global Climate Change Office at USAID. Interesting analysis and enjoyed the presentation. I was just curious. It seemed I was a little surprised by your kind of the top line, which is that the sea level rise, the coastal exposure, ends up being a much smaller piece of the overall impact, even though it's fairly iconic. And I wondered, for Indonesia, right? I mean, you often hear Jakarta is one of the most threatened cities and so forth. I wondered if you had any just reflections on that, and you know, takeaways from that point.
No value. I'm kidding. They're of no value. They're, you know, but they don't have the economic value that the flooding of Jakarta and other coastal cities would have, and so that's why the sea level rise, the value is really only in urban areas. You know. Maybe I didn't quite get the question.
So in other words, in this case, the amount of sea level rise that you're projecting in 2050 isn't enough to have an impact on Jakarta.
It is, and that would be a significant loss there. That's why if you go back, the sea level rise, most of the loss of economic value is in Jakarta, and not in losing aquaculture or losing some rice paddies that are around there. Most of the economic loss, the value, is in Jakarta. Yes. Yes. Yeah, of course, you know Jakarta. Jakarta will just flood right up to, yeah.
Okay, thank you, everybody. It's a little after 5:30. Thank you for coming. Next month, It'll be January 12th. It will be Tim Finan and Mamadou Barrow talking about
decentralization. They did a study on decentralization and its effects relationship with a village-level climate change adaptation in Mali, which is kind of an interesting study. So, be there. Aloha.
And happy holidays. We'll see you in January. Thank you for coming.